Thank you, Mr. President, for calling this day of prayer and remembrance. We needed it at this time.
When Billy Graham passed away in 2018, his family made an unexpected discovery in his North Carolina study. Hidden in drawers and cabinets were private writings that revealed the inner struggles of America's most famous preacher. His journals exposed crises of faith that nearly ended his ministry, secrets about his relationship with Nixon, and confessions about his biggest regrets. The man millions saw on television had a deeper story to tell. Billy Graham was born on November 7, 1918, just before the end of World War I. He grew up on a large dairy farm near Charlotte, North Carolina. His parents, William and Morrow Graham, owned 300 acres of land with over 70 cows. From an early age, Billy learned discipline through hard work, waking up every morning to milk cows before and after school. At 15, he had an unusual experience. His father made him drink beer until he got sick, an event that led him to dislike alcohol for the rest of his life. As a teenager, Billy seemed like any other kid, more interested in baseball and girls than religion. But everything changed when he was 16. In 1934, a revival meeting came to Charlotte, led by preacher Mordecai Ham. Billy had no interest in attending. He had been rejected by a local youth group for being too worldly. But a farmer named Albert McMakin kept urging him to go. Finally, Billy agreed. During the sermon, something powerful happened. He couldn't recall the preacher's exact words, but he felt an overwhelming conviction. As he walked forward to give his life to Christ, he knew his future had changed forever. At 18, Billy enrolled at Bob Jones College, but struggled with its strict rules and rigid environment. After just one semester, he nearly got expelled. The school's founder even told him he'd never amount to much, predicting he'd only be a small-town preacher. Instead of giving up, Billy transferred to Florida Bible Institute, a decision that changed everything. There, he found a supportive community and developed his preaching skills in unusual ways, practicing sermons on trees, birds, and even alligators. In 1938, while walking on the school's golf course, he wrestled with his future. He knelt in the grass and prayed, "Lord, I'll do whatever you want." That moment sealed his decision to dedicate his life to preaching. By 1939, at just 20 years old, Billy was ordained as a Southern Baptist minister, despite his Presbyterian upbringing. He was baptized by immersion, a different experience from his childhood sprinkling. Even at a young age, people saw his potential to spread God's message. During World War II, Billy Graham's influence began to grow. At 25, he delivered his first Youth for Christ sermon in Chicago, drawing over 2,000 attendees. That was just the beginning. Soon, he was traveling across the U.S., Canada, and Europe, preaching at rallies and expanding Youth for Christ. By 1945, he became the organization's first full-time employee, planning events on a national and international scale. His sermons were different from traditional preaching. Youth for Christ rallies combined passionate messages with music, celebrity testimonies, and high energy, attracting massive crowds, sometimes up to 70,000 people. By 1946, the movement had grown to 300 chapters in the U.S. and 200 internationally. The real turning point came in 1949 at the Los Angeles Crusade. The event started small, held under a tent known as the Canvas Cathedral, with around 3,000 attendees. But then, something remarkable happened. Radio host Stuart Hamblin and former Olympian Louis Zamperini publicly gave their lives to Christ. The media took notice, and Billy Graham's journey to becoming one of the most influential evangelists in history had truly begun. Media mogul William Randolph Hearst told his newspapers to promote Billy Graham, and almost overnight, he became a national sensation. His Los Angeles crusade, initially planned for 3 weeks, extended to 8, drawing around 400,000 attendees. Thousands made decisions for Christ, turning Billy into a household name and opening doors for future crusades across the country. By 1950, Billy realized he needed a structured way to manage his growing ministry. That year, he founded the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, BGEA, in a small Minnesota office with a bold mission: spreading the gospel through every possible medium. One of its first major projects was the body radio program Hour of Decision, which debuted in November 1950. The program quickly gained millions of listeners worldwide. As the BGEA expanded, it established offices in cities like London, Sydney, and Buenos Aires, while also launching magazines, films, and television programs. But beyond growth, Billy and his team wanted to set a high ethical standard. In 1948, 2 years before forming the BGEA, they gathered in Modesto, California, to draft the Modesto Manifesto, a set of strict guidelines ensuring transparency in finances, personal integrity, and honest reporting of their successes. This helped build trust and protect the ministry's reputation. Billy's influence soon extended beyond the U.S. His first major international crusade took place in Saint-Tropez, London, in 1954, lasting 12 weeks and drawing over 2 million people. This marked the beginning of his global mission, combining mass gatherings with media outreach and local church support. One of the most remarkable aspects of his work was his ability to unite people across racial and political divides. In 1973, during apartheid in South Africa, he insisted that everyone sit together, regardless of race, and boldly declared apartheid a sin, an act that angered the government but won him worldwide respect. In 1977, he preached in communist Hungary, where religion was often restricted, drawing 30,000 attendees. This breakthrough led to invitations to other communist nations, including North Korea, in 1992. One of his greatest milestones came in 1995, when he used satellites to broadcast his message to 185 countries in 116 languages at the same time. Over 10 million people watched, and 2.5 million responded. By the time he retired, Billy had spoken to over 215 million people across 185 countries. His largest crowd? 1.1 million in South Korea in 1973. Beyond these numbers, Billy's message changed lives. In 1986, at a crusade in Amsterdam, a young man struggling with drug addiction found faith and later became a Christian leader in the Netherlands. Billy wasn't just about live events, he mastered media. His radio show, Hour of Decision, grew from 150 stations in 1950 to 800 worldwide by 1954. In 1957, his New York crusade aired on ABC for 16 weeks, reaching 96 million viewers, 70% of American households. The response was overwhelming, with ABC's phone lines crashing on opening night. His newspaper column, My Answer, was published in hundreds of newspapers, reaching 5 million readers. Even in later years, Billy embraced new technology. In 1989, he launched one of the first Christian websites, offering live chat for spiritual counseling. By 2008, his online ministry was reaching 1.5 million people per year. In 1956, Billy founded Christianity Today, a magazine that became a key voice for evangelicals, covering major issues like civil rights and the Vietnam War. But despite his success, in 1949, Billy faced a crisis that nearly derailed his faith. At 30 years old, just weeks before his defining Los Angeles crusade, he began questioning the Bible. His doubts were influenced by Charles Templeton, a former preacher and friend, who had started questioning how Scripture aligned with modern science. Billy felt lost. If he couldn't fully trust the Bible, how could he preach with confidence? Seeking answers, he retreated to Forest Home, a Christian retreat in the mountains of California. It was there, alone in the woods, that Billy Graham faced his biggest spiritual test. At Forest Home, Billy Graham hoped to find clarity. He spoke with Henrietta Mears, a wise Christian teacher, who warned him that doubting the Bible could lead to doubting everything else. She and others encouraged him to seek God's help. One evening, Graham walked alone into the woods. Stopping by a tree stump, he placed his Bible on it and prayed. He admitted he didn't have all the answers, but chose to trust the Bible by faith. "I'm going to believe this is your word, even if I don't understand everything." At that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if a burden had been lifted. He later described it as one of the most defining experiences of his life. When the Los Angeles Crusade began on September 25, 1949, Graham was a changed preacher. He spoke with confidence, often starting his sermons with, "The Bible says," and people could feel how deeply he believed it. The crusade, originally planned for 3 weeks, 35,000 people attended, and 3,000 made decisions for Christ. Media mogul William Randolph Hearst ordered his newspapers to promote Graham, catapulting him to national fame. From that moment, there was no turning back. Over his lifetime, he would preach to over 215 million people in 185 countries, including his largest crowd of 1.1 million in South Korea. That night at Forest Home didn't just change Billy Graham. It shaped the future of evangelical Christianity. Billy Graham and Richard Nixon, a close but controversial friendship. Graham had strong relationships with U.S. presidents, but none were as close as his bond with Richard Nixon. They first met in the 1950s when Nixon was a senator, and over time, their friendship deepened. By 1968, Graham was actively involved in Nixon's presidential campaign, advising on how to gain support from evangelical voters. He wasn't just a spiritual guide, he was part of the political strategy. Between 1969 and 1974, he visited the White House 30 times, even spending the night on occasion. He prayed at Nixon's 1969 inauguration, calling him a leader chosen by God, and provided counsel on major issues, including the Vietnam War. However, his political involvement went further than most expected. In a shocking moment, Graham suggested bombing dikes in North Vietnam if peace talks failed, a move that could have led to massive civilian casualties. It revealed just how entangled he had become in political affairs. During the Watergate scandal, Graham stood by Nixon, refusing to believe he had done anything wrong. But in 1974, when White House tapes exposed Nixon's lies, Graham was devastated. Reading the transcripts, he reportedly broke down in tears and even vomited. The betrayal shook him to the core, making him reconsider his deep political involvement. Another controversy from Graham's past surfaced. Secret tapes from a 1972 conversation with Nixon revealed the two making anti-Semitic remarks. Nixon complained about Jewish control of the media, and Graham agreed, calling it a problem that needed to be fixed. He even admitted that while many Jewish people were friendly to him, they didn't know how he truly felt. When the tapes were released decades later, the public was shocked. Graham, then 83 years old, claimed he didn't remember the conversation but issued a public apology, saying his words didn't reflect his true love for Jewish people. Despite these controversies, Billy Graham's impact on Christianity remained undeniable. But his deep entanglement in politics and the Watergate scandal served as a painful lesson, one that would shape his approach in the years to come. Despite his public apology for the 1972 anti-Semitic remarks, the controversy damaged his reputation as a unifier. As Billy Graham grew older, he reflected on his past and admitted to mistakes. In a 2011 interview, he expressed regret for getting too involved in politics. While he believed in guiding leaders spiritually, he realized he had crossed the line. Watergate was a wake-up call. Once he saw Nixon's betrayal, it changed his view on politics forever. By 1981, Graham publicly warned against mixing religion too deeply with politics, stating that religious groups being used by politicians could harm both faith and the country. However, one of his most controversial actions came in 1974 after Nixon resigned. Graham urged President Gerald Ford to pardon Nixon, believing it was the best way for the country to move forward. He personally called Nixon to offer comfort, and later persuaded Ford to make the decision. When Ford granted the pardon, it sparked national outrage, but Graham stood by his belief that it was necessary for healing. His close ties to presidents showcased his influence, but also exposed the risks of being too involved in political power. In 1953, at a crusade in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Graham made a bold stand against segregation. Seeing ropes dividing the white and black sections, he walked over and tore them down with his own hands. He told the event organizers, "If these ropes stay up, you can have this revival without me." This happened a year before the Supreme Court ruled school segregation illegal. Some people supported him, but others, including his head usher, who quit in protest, were furious. Graham lost some white supporters, but he refused to back down. From that moment, he ensured that all his crusades had integrated seating, even in the deeply segregated South. In 1957, during his New York City crusade, he realized most of the audience was white. Seeking change, he turned to Howard Jones, a black pastor, for advice. Jones urged him to bring his message directly to Harlem. Graham listened, holding rallies in Harlem and Brooklyn, which drew thousands of black attendees and transformed the diversity of his crusade audiences. However, his push for racial integration wasn't without backlash. Segregationists sent him hateful messages and racial slurs. In 1964, shortly after the Birmingham church bombing, Graham held an integrated crusade in Alabama, despite the threat of violence. Protesters vandalized billboards advertising the event, and police had to protect him from potential attacks. Despite these efforts, Graham was criticized for not doing more during the civil rights movement. While Martin Luther King Jr. and other activists used protests and direct action to fight systemic racism, Graham avoided political demonstrations. He preferred to work through spiritual influence, which some saw as too passive in the face of deep racial injustice. His relationship with King was complicated but respectful. They shared a vision of racial unity, but they had different approaches to achieving it. In 1960, when King was arrested for participating in a sit-in, many expected Graham to publicly speak out in support. Instead, he chose to work behind the scenes, calling government officials to push for King's release, rather than making a public statement. Billy Graham's role in the fight for racial equality was significant, but not without controversy. While he took a stand against segregation within his own ministry, many believed he could have done more to support the broader civil rights movement. While Billy Graham opposed segregation at his crusades, he often took a cautious approach to civil rights issues. He believed hearts had to change through faith, rather than through protests or legal action. This frustrated civil rights leaders who argued that unjust laws needed to be actively challenged. During the 1963 Birmingham protests, when peaceful demonstrators were attacked with fire hoses and police dogs, Graham stayed silent. He also didn't attend the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. Instead, he said, "Only when Christ comes again will white and black children walk hand in hand." To many, this sounded like he didn't believe change was possible in the present. His reluctance to take a strong public stance stemmed partly from his ties to political leaders, including segregationists. In 1965, during the Selma voting rights campaign, he criticized the protesters' tactics, saying, "I don't condone violence. It's not the best way." Civil rights activists, who practiced nonviolent resistance, were disappointed. His relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. was a mix of respect and tension. In 1957, Graham invited King to pray at his New York crusade, and King praised him for promoting unity. But by 1958, their relationship became strained when King urged Graham not to let a segregationist introduce him at a Texas event. Graham ignored this advice, saying he didn't get involved in politics. Graham's stance on race often seemed inconsistent. He demanded integrated seating at crusades, yet at times allowed segregated choirs. In 1965, after the violence in Selma, he preached in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, saying, "I'm not here to talk about local issues, just the gospel." Many saw this as avoiding the hard truths about racism. Later in life, he admitted he could have done more. In 1989, he said, "I wish I had done more for civil rights when I was younger." Some praised his honesty, while others questioned why someone with such influence hadn't taken a stronger stand earlier. Billy Graham's marriage and personal life. Billy's love story with Ruth Bell Graham was one of deep devotion. They met at Wheaton College in 1940, but it took Billy a month to build up the courage to ask her out. Their first date was listening to Handel's Messiah on December 15, 1940. Ruth had once dreamed of being a missionary in Tibet, but after much prayer, she felt God had a different plan, supporting Billy's ministry. They married on August 13, 1943, just 2 months after graduating. Their 63-year marriage lasted until Ruth's passing in 2007. Though Billy traveled often, they stayed connected through daily phone calls and nightly prayers. Ruth's wit kept their relationship lively. After a car accident, when Billy told her she couldn't drive anymore, she joked, "Abraham didn't take Sarah's camel away." Billy often said that Ruth was the strongest influence in his life. She was his biggest supporter, but also his greatest source of wisdom and grounding, a shift in theology, and embracing Christian unity. Early in his ministry, Billy followed strict fundamentalist teaching, but his views evolved over time. In the late 1940s and 1950s, he chose to work with Protestant and even Catholic leaders, breaking from the hardline evangelical movement. Some supporters criticized him for this, but it allowed him to reach a much broader audience. By the 1960s, his crusades were drawing over 100,000 people, and he was becoming one of the most influential Christian leaders of all time. In 1964, he met with Pope Paul VI, shocking many Protestant followers. However, he remained focused on spreading the gospel to as many people as possible. Some of his statements on salvation sparked debate. He suggested that people who hadn't directly heard about Jesus might still find salvation if they followed the truth in their hearts. Many evangelical leaders criticized this view, but Graham remained steadfast in his belief in God's grace and love for all people. In his later years, Billy faced many health struggles, but remained strong in faith. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 1992, along with prostate cancer and hydrocephalus, fluid buildup in the brain. Despite surgeries and treatments, he continued his ministry as long as he could. By his 90s, his eyesight and hearing declined, but his mind remained sharp. In his book, Nearing Home, he reflected on aging and preparing for death, saying his faith gave him peace. His final public event was his 95th birthday in 2013. After that, he spent his remaining years at home in Montreat, North Carolina, surrounded by family. On February 21, 2018, Billy Graham passed away at age 99, leaving behind a legacy of faith, love, and a message that reached millions.